In the depths of the Norwegian fjords, Admiral Oscar Kometz examined the security assessments surrounding his precious charge with unwavering certainty. His technical officers had performed exhaustive calculations that demonstrated beyond any shadow of doubt that the Tirpitz could not possibly be attacked successfully in her current position. The massive battleship rested securely in Kaldfjord, protected by defensive arrangements that represented the pinnacle of German naval engineering and tactical planning. Multiple layers of anti-submarine netting stretched downward through the dark waters to depths of 75 feet, while torpedo barriers encircled the anchorage in overlapping patterns. Shore-mounted artillery batteries maintained constant vigilance, their fire control systems calibrated to detect and obliterate any approaching threat within a 20-kilometre perimeter. The water approaches had been systematically mined, patrol vessels maintained round-the-clock circuits of the fjord, and sophisticated hydrophone installations monitored every underwater sound signature. The Admiral's staff had concluded that no conventional submarine could possibly breach such comprehensive defences without being detected and destroyed. The fundamental physics of underwater naval warfare, as understood by German naval doctrine, made such an attack mathematically impossible. Any standard submarine attempting to navigate into Kaldfjord would need to surface repeatedly during its approach, thereby exposing itself to the dozens of observation posts that ringed the anchorage. The protective netting alone represented an insurmountable obstacle, inspected twice each day by trained divers who would immediately detect any attempt at cutting or breaching. Kometz had stated in his reports with absolute conviction that the Tirpitz enjoyed security comparable to a vessel in a heavily defended German dry dock facility. Her northern anchorage represented the safest possible position for such a valuable asset. What Admiral Kometz could not have known was that at that precise moment, 6 experimental submarines of revolutionary design were departing from Scotland, making their way northward toward Norwegian waters under tow from conventional submarines. These extraordinary vessels, each roughly the size of a railway carriage, carried crews of 4 men who were preparing to accomplish what German naval science had declared to be physically impossible. The British had designated these craft as X-craft, and they represented a completely new approach to submarine warfare. These tiny vessels were about to demonstrate that even the most comprehensively defended warship in naval history remained vulnerable to attackers in submarines so diminutive they could slip beneath anti-submarine barriers, so silent they evaded the most sensitive hydrophone arrays, yet carrying sufficient explosive power to cripple a 50,000-ton battleship. Within 11 days, these miniature submarines would penetrate every defensive layer the Germans had so meticulously constructed, position 8 tons of high explosive beneath the Tirpitz's hull, and prove conclusively that no anchorage, regardless of how thoroughly defended, could truly be considered impregnable. The German Admiralty's most sophisticated defensive planning was about to be defeated by crews of volunteers operating submarines that violated every accepted principle of conventional naval operations. Admiral Karl Dönitz had assumed command of the Kriegsmarine at the beginning of 1943, replacing Admiral Raeder in the aftermath of the Battle of the Barents Sea that had occurred on the final day of 1942. Dönitz personally supervised the defensive arrangements protecting the Tirpitz, understanding with perfect clarity the strategic value that the battleship represented even when immobilized in a remote fjord. British strategic calculations demonstrated that protecting Arctic convoys from the potential threat posed by Tirpitz required the permanent deployment of 2 battleships, 1 fleet carrier, numerous cruisers, and dozens of destroyers in northern waters. The Tirpitz functioned as what naval theorists called a fleet in being, forcing the Royal Navy to maintain significant naval forces in the region solely to contain the German battleship. From Dönitz's perspective, this represented the ideal strategic equation: a single German battleship neutralizing an entire British fleet without firing a single shot in combat. The defensive installations at Kaldfjord represented the culmination of more than 2 years of German engineering expertise and tactical development. The fjord's natural geography provided inherent protection, with sheer cliff faces rising 800 feet on both sides, making aerial attack approaches exceptionally dangerous for attacking aircraft. The air defense systems surrounding the anchorage were extraordinarily dense, with 88 anti-aircraft guns positioned throughout the surrounding heights, capable of creating what German gunners described as an impenetrable curtain of defensive fire. The approaches from the sea presented even more formidable obstacles. Double layers of anti-torpedo netting surrounded the Tirpitz, with each net extending from the water's surface down to depths of 75 feet, far exceeding what Allied intelligence had suggested. Shore-based torpedo batteries covered every conceivable angle of approach from the sea. Patrol boats equipped with hydrophones and depth charges maintained constant vigilance throughout day and night. German naval engineers had calculated that any attacking force would need to successfully overcome 7 distinct defensive layers before reaching the battleship herself. Each individual layer had been designed to be independently sufficient to stop any submarine attack. When combined together, they created what Kriegsmarine doctrine considered absolute security that could not be breached. Captain Hans Meyer had assumed command of the Tirpitz in February of 1943 and conducted defensive exercises on a weekly basis. His crew of 2,600 men could bring the ship to full action stations within 4 minutes of any alert. The battleship's own armament included 16 anti-aircraft guns of 105 mm plus 58 20mm cannon that could devastate any surface threat that approached. The ship's armour belt, measuring 12 inches thick at the waterline, was considered impervious to torpedo attack based on contemporary naval architecture. Even if an enemy submarine somehow managed to penetrate all the external defences, German naval architects firmly believed that the Tirpitz could absorb multiple torpedo impacts and remain operational. The vessel had been designed with redundant systems throughout, compartmentalized flooding controls, and damage control capabilities that exceeded those of any other warship afloat. Captain Meyer reported to the admiral commanding northern waters that the Tirpitz enjoyed greater safety in Kalfjord than she would in the naval base at Wilhelmshaven on the German coast. The only threat he acknowledged as genuinely concerning was heavy bombing from the air, and even that threat was mitigated by smoke generators that could completely obscure the entire fjord in 8 minutes, rendering targeting impossible. At HMS Wabel, which occupied a former luxury hotel on the Isle of Bute that now served as headquarters for the 12th Submarine Flotilla, the challenge of attacking the Tirpitz had consumed 18 months of intensive planning and training. The operation was directed from this Royal Navy shore establishment located in Port Bannatyne on the Isle of Bute. The building had previously been the Kyle's Hydropathic Hotel, a luxury establishment with 88 bedrooms, which had been requisitioned by the Admiralty to serve as the flotilla's operational headquarters. The X-craft submarines themselves represented a revolutionary approach to submarine design, purpose-built for this singular mission profile. At 51 feet in length and displacing 35 tons, they were approximately 1/10 the size of a conventional submarine. The crew of 4 men operated in conditions so cramped that they could not all stand upright simultaneously within the hull. These submarines carried no torpedoes, no deck gun, and no conventional offensive weapons except for 2 side charges, each containing 2 tons of amatol explosive. These charges could be released beneath a target vessel and detonated by timer mechanisms. The charges were designed to sink to the seabed and create a tamping effect that would buckle the hull plates above through the focusing of the blast energy. The volunteers who crewed these extraordinary craft understood with complete clarity the near-suicidal nature of the mission they had undertaken. Lieutenant Donald Cameron, commanding X6, had trained for 2 years specifically for this single attack operation. Lieutenant Basil Place, commanding X-7, had practiced penetrating mock net defences hundreds of times in training exercises. Lieutenant Henty Creer, commanding X5, had helped develop the tactics they would employ during the actual attack. Each man understood the extreme risks they were accepting. If detected while approaching the protective nets, they would be depth charged to destruction. If they became entangled in the nets, they would suffocate as their oxygen supply ran out within the sealed hull. If they successfully planted their explosive charges, they would have minimal time to escape the blast radius before detonation. The informal betting at Warburg gave them approximately 1 chance in 5 of returning alive from the mission. Yet when Admiral Sir Max Horton, Flag Officer Submarines, visited in early September of 1943 to wish them luck before departure, he found the crews in extraordinary spirits. Their confidence was not the result of youthful bravado or foolish daredevilry, but was based on the firm conviction, formed during many months of arduous training under realistic conditions, that their submarines were genuinely capable of accomplishing everything that their crews demanded of them. The technical challenges inherent in the mission defied all conventional submarine doctrine and operational practice. The X-craft would need to be towed 1,200 nautical miles from Scotland to Norway by regular submarines, a journey that would require 8 days through some of the world's roughest and most dangerous seas. During this extended passage, 3-man passage crews would operate the X-craft, conserving the energy and mental alertness of the 4-man operational crews who would conduct the actual attack. The transfer of crews would need to occur in enemy-controlled waters, in weather conditions that made even standing on a submarine's deck hazardous and potentially fatal. Once released from their towing submarines, the X-craft would need to navigate 50 miles of heavily defended waterway, penetrate multiple layers of net barriers, avoid extensive minefields, evade constantly patrolling patrol boats, and position themselves beneath a target they might not even be able to see clearly. Their periscopes had been deliberately manufactured to be ultra-thin to minimize the chance of visual detection, which unfortunately provided minimal visibility for the operators. Their maximum speed when submerged was only 4 knots. Their endurance was ultimately limited by the physical capacity of crews operating hand-cranked pumps and breathing air that became increasingly toxic with each passing hour. On the 11th of September, 1943, 6 conventional submarines departed from Loch Cairnborn in Scotland, each one towing an X-craft through mountainous seas. The passage immediately validated German skepticism about the feasibility of such long-range special operations. X-9, under tow by HMS Tirpitz, disappeared during the night of September 15th to 16th when its tow line parted in extremely heavy weather. All hands were lost without any possibility of rescue. X-8, commanded by Lieutenant Jack Smart, developed catastrophic leaks in its explosive charges and was forced to jettison them to prevent the submarine from sinking. When the charges detonated prematurely in shallow water, they damaged X-8 so severely that she had to be scuttled to prevent capture. By the 19th of September, only 4 X-craft remained operational and capable of continuing the mission. During the extended transit northward, Rear Admiral Submarines transmitted the final attack orders to the approaching vessels. X-5, X-6, and X-7 would attack the Tirpitz in Calfjord, while X-10 would target the battle cruiser Scharnhorst. However, X-10 immediately developed severe mechanical problems that threatened to compromise the entire operation. Her periscope flooded, rendering visual navigation nearly impossible, and her gyro compass failed, eliminating accurate navigation. Her commander, Lieutenant Kenneth Hudspeth, faced an agonizing decision with profound implications. Any attempt to attack in X-10's compromised condition would likely result in detection by German defences, which would compromise the entire operation and destroy the chances of his companion X-craft. Hudspeth made the difficult choice to abort his attack, lying on the seabed outside Calfjord until the attack window passed, ensuring that his mechanical problems would not alert the Germans to the presence of other attacking submarines. What none of the attackers knew at the time was that the Scharnhorst was not even present in port, having departed for training exercises at sea. The 3 remaining operational X-craft began their final approach to Calfjord on the 20th of September 1943. The Norwegian resistance movement, particularly the brothers Torbjörn and Einar Johansen, had provided detailed intelligence about the net defences, patrol schedules, and the exact position of the Tirpitz within the anchorage. This intelligence had been collected and transmitted to the Royal Navy by the Norwegian resistance organisation known as the XU Network. However, as the X-craft commanders would soon discover to their horror, the defensive arrangements were even more formidable than reported. The nets extended deeper than intelligence had indicated, the patrols were more frequent than expected, and most critically, there were 3 layers of anti-torpedo nets surrounding the Tirpitz, not the 2 that intelligence had confidently stated. Each X-craft commander would discover these intelligence errors only when they became entangled in nets that, according to their briefings, should not have existed at those locations. The approach through the outer fjords tested every skill that the crews had developed during their exhaustive training. They could only surface at night, and even then only for brief minutes to recharge batteries and refresh the poisonous air inside the hull. By day they crept along the bottom, navigating by compass and stopwatch alone, occasionally risking a brief periscope observation that might reveal their position to alert observers. German patrol boats passed directly overhead repeatedly, their propeller noise filling the X-craft's tiny hulls with mechanical thunder that seemed certain to give away their position. The crews operated under conditions that would have been considered torture in any other context. The temperature inside the hulls approached freezing. Condensation dripped constantly from every surface, soaking the men and their equipment. Carbon dioxide levels rose steadily despite the chemical air purifier cartridges working at maximum capacity. Men began to hallucinate from oxygen deprivation and complete exhaustion. Yet they pressed forward relentlessly, covering the 50 miles to Kalfjord in a deadly game of underwater stealth that required absolute precision. Lieutenant Place in X7 reached Brattholmen Island, 10 miles from the Tirpitz, on the evening of September 21st. Through his periscope, he could observe German sailors on the decks of vessels moving through the anchorage, seemingly unaware of the threat approaching beneath the dark waters. The temptation to attack immediately was overwhelming, but the operational plan required coordination among all attacking craft. All attacks were scheduled to occur on September 22nd, maximizing the probability that at least one X-craft would succeed in placing charges even if others were detected and destroyed. Place bottomed X7 in a small cove and waited, his crew breathing air that grew more poisonous with each passing hour, testing their endurance to its absolute limits. Lieutenant Cameron in X6 faced a crisis that would have terminated most military operations immediately. His periscope had been leaking progressively since September 20th, flooding to the point where it was nearly completely opaque and essentially useless for navigation. His approach to the target would have to be conducted by compass alone, approaching a massive target he could not see through defensive systems he could not observe. His crew spent the night attempting emergency repairs with minimal tools and limited success. In the early morning hours of September 22nd, both X6 and X7 began their final approaches into Kalfjord itself. Cameron's first significant obstacle was the anti-submarine net positioned at Kalfjord's entrance. His original plan had been to deploy his diver to cut through the net underwater, but fate intervened in an unexpected manner. At dawn, he observed through his severely damaged periscope that the net was being opened to admit a coastal vessel into the anchorage. In a split-second decision that exemplified the entire operation's remarkable combination of careful calculation and sheer audacity, Cameron ordered full speed on the surface. X6 charged through the gap in the immediate wake of the coaster, her hull partially exposed above the waterline, passing within 50 yards of German sentries stationed at the entrance. Remarkably, no alarm was raised, and the tiny submarine passed through the first barrier undetected. X7, under Place's command, experienced even worse fortune with the protective nets. Believing the intelligence reports that stated the nets extended only to 60 feet depth, he dove to 75 feet, intending to pass safely beneath them. The intelligence estimates regarding the net defences had been catastrophically wrong. X-7 became completely entangled in netting, her hull wrapped thoroughly in steel mesh. For 30 agonising minutes, Place alternately flooded and blew ballast tanks, running his motor at full astern, then full ahead, desperately trying to tear the submarine free from the nets. The noise produced must have been clearly audible to any hydrophone operator listening in the area, yet inexplicably no alarm sounded and no depth charges fell. Finally, after what seemed an eternity to the crew, X7 broke free from the entanglement, though the gyro compass was now completely unreliable and essentially useless for accurate navigation. The inner defences of Kalfjord should theoretically have been completely impenetrable to any attacking force. Patrol boats crossed the water every 15 minutes on regular schedules. Observer posts equipped with powerful binoculars monitored every square metre of the water surface. Hydrophone stations listened continuously for any unusual sound signature beneath the waves. Yet despite all these sophisticated defensive measures, both X6 and X7 continued their stealthy approach toward the Tirpitz herself. X-6, now virtually blind due to her flooded periscope, ran aground on an uncharted sandbank less than 1,000 yards from the massive battleship. The submarine broke surface completely, her entire hull fully exposed in daylight, while Cameron struggled desperately to free her from the obstruction. Sailors on a German tanker anchored nearby watched the small craft, but remarkably assumed it was one of their own vessels conducting some sort of routine operation. This assumption saved X-6 from immediate destruction. Both X6 and X7 reached the final defensive barrier, the anti-torpedo nets surrounding Tirpitz herself, around 7 o'clock in the morning. These nets, completely unknown to British intelligence services, consisted of 3 separate layers, each extending considerably deeper than any reports had indicated. Cameron, unable to see anything through his flooded periscope, made the fateful decision to surface and attempt a visual approach on the surface. X6 broke the surface just 500 yards from the Tirpitz. German sailors on the battleship's deck could clearly see the tiny submarine in the morning light. For several surreal seconds, nothing happened as recognition slowly dawned. Then suddenly, alarm sirens began sounding across the entire anchorage as the Germans realized they were under attack. Cameron knew with absolute certainty that he had only minutes before depth charges would begin falling around his position. He ordered full speed ahead, deliberately crashing X6 into the torpedo nets at maximum velocity, hoping that sheer momentum would carry the small craft through the steel barrier. The submarine became tangled immediately, held fast in the heavy steel mesh. For 15 agonizing minutes that must have seemed like hours, X6 hung suspended in the nets, while German sailors scrambled frantically to man anti-submarine weapons and prepare depth charges. Cameron ordered his crew to physically rock the boat, shifting their collective weight from side to side, while simultaneously running the motor at maximum revolutions. Finally, with a terrible tearing of steel plating, X6 broke through the netting. She was now inside all defensive barriers, less than 200 yards from the massive hull of the Tirpitz. Cameron immediately released both side charges, each containing 2 tons of amatol explosive, setting the timer mechanisms to detonate in approximately 1 hour. X-6 had successfully completed her primary mission, but any hope of escape was now impossible. With her periscope destroyed, compass rendered useless, and German destroyers already heading at high speed toward her position, Cameron made the only decision possible. He surfaced X6 directly alongside the towering hull of the Tirpitz and surrendered his crew to avoid pointless deaths. Place in X-7 was experiencing his own desperate struggle with the protective netting. After his first entanglement at the outer barrier, he had successfully navigated to the inner nets, only to discover they were far more extensive than any intelligence had suggested possible. X7 spent 45 agonizing minutes attempting to find a way through the multiple layers, becoming entangled twice more in the process. Each time, Place was forced to blow ballast tanks to break free, sending up telltale air bubbles to the surface that should have triggered immediate attack by German forces. Yet the German observers, completely focused on the dramatic surrender of X6 occurring nearby, failed to notice the air bubbles or comprehend their significance. Finally, through a combination of skill and extraordinary luck, X-7 slipped beneath the innermost nets and reached her designated attack position directly beneath the Tirpitz. Place released his explosive charges directly beneath the battleship's engine rooms, also setting the timers for approximately 1 hour before detonation. His mission was complete, but now he faced the nearly impossible task of escaping. The fate of X-5 under Lieutenant Henty Krier remains one of the operation's enduring mysteries that has never been fully resolved. She disappeared with her entire crew during the attack, and the exact circumstances of her loss remain unclear. She is believed to have been sunk by a direct hit from one of Tirpitz's powerful 105mm guns before she could successfully place her demolition charges beneath the battleship. Later in the morning, lookouts stationed on the Tirpitz spotted a submarine periscope approximately 500 yards outside the protective nets. The battleship's guns opened fire immediately, and observers reported scoring direct hits on the periscope. Whether X-5 had already managed to place her charges or was still attempting to penetrate the defences when she was hit will never be known with certainty. All 4 crew members perished in the attack. Aboard the Tirpitz, Captain Meyer had initially refused to believe the initial reports of midget submarines penetrating the anchorage. The concept of submarines small enough to penetrate the sophisticated net defences, yet somehow carrying enough explosives to threaten a massive battleship, seemed completely absurd and contrary to all naval doctrine. However, with X-6's crew now standing as prisoners on his deck and additional reports of X-7 entangled somewhere in the nets, Meyer was forced to accept the impossible reality and ordered immediate countermeasures. Upon capture and interrogation, the crew members from X-6 informed the German captain Hans Meyer that massive explosions would occur beneath the Tirpitz within approximately 1 hour. Meyer immediately attempted to move the Tirpitz using her anchor chains, trying to physically slide the enormous ship away from wherever the explosive charges might have been positioned on the seabed. Divers were ordered down immediately into the cold, dark water, and they reported finding massive charges sitting on the bottom beneath the ship. At 8:12 in the morning, the first tremendous explosion erupted beneath the Tirpitz. The force was absolutely extraordinary, physically lifting the entire 50,000-ton battleship several feet out of the water and shifting her bodily to port. 3 more massive detonations followed in rapid succession over the next few seconds. The cumulative effect was absolutely catastrophic to the ship's machinery and structure. All 3 of Tirpitz's main turbines were violently knocked off their mounting foundations. Electrical systems throughout the massive ship failed simultaneously. One of the main turrets was physically lifted off its roller path and became jammed in position. Fire control systems were completely destroyed. Most critically for the ship's future operational capability, the hull itself was twisted by the blast forces, opening seams throughout the structure that allowed progressive flooding into multiple compartments. While the Tirpitz was not in immediate danger of sinking at her moorings, she took on over 1,400 tons of water and suffered structural and mechanical damage that would prove irreparable. The comprehensive damage assessment conducted by German naval engineers over the following days was absolutely devastating to any hope of returning the ship to operational status. Every major system aboard the Tirpitz had been affected by the explosions in some way. The main armament was largely unusable, with turrets jammed and the fire control systems destroyed. The propulsion system was completely wrecked beyond any hope of repair, without access to major dry dock facilities that did not exist in Norway. The 8 tons of amatol explosive that had detonated underneath the Tirpitz had not succeeded in sinking the battleship outright, but had severely damaged all 3 main engines, all lighting and electrical equipment throughout the ship, one entire generator room, the hydrophone detection station, anti-aircraft control positions, the port rudder, range-finding equipment, and both B and X main turrets. The admiral commanding Northern Waters reported directly to Berlin that the Tirpitz would require a minimum of 6 months of intensive repairs, assuming she could somehow reach a properly equipped port facility for the work. She never would. The aftermath of the attack for the various X-craft crews proved remarkably varied in outcome. Cameron and his entire crew from X6 were already prisoners when the massive explosions occurred, having surrendered before the charges detonated. Place from X-7 managed to escape from his sinking craft after the explosions, but was quickly captured on the surface by German patrol boats. 2 members of his crew, Sub-Lieutenant Whittam and Engine Room Artificer Whitley, went down with X7 when she sank following the explosions, dying at their posts. Sub-Lieutenant Aitken miraculously escaped from the sunken X7 using Davis submarine escape apparatus, somehow surfacing alive after being trapped on the bottom for hours in conditions that should have killed him. The Germans, despite the catastrophic damage inflicted on their most powerful ship, treated the captured prisoners with notable respect, recognizing the extraordinary courage required to undertake such a desperate attack against overwhelming odds. Admiral Dönitz received the comprehensive damage reports with a mixture of intense rage at the successful attack and reluctant professional admiration for the attackers. In his official war diary, he wrote that the attack had demonstrated extraordinary courage and determination on the part of the British crews, but the strategic implications for Germany were absolutely catastrophic. The mere theoretical possibility of the Tirpitz sortying into the Atlantic, which had successfully tied down enormous Allied naval resources for years, had been completely eliminated in a single morning. The psychological impact on the Kriegsmarine was equally severe and far-reaching. If midget submarines could successfully penetrate the most heavily defended anchorage in German possession, then no naval base anywhere could be considered truly safe from such attacks. Dönitz ordered immediate comprehensive reviews of all naval base defences throughout German-controlled waters, but the fundamental problem was inherently unsolvable. The X-craft had successfully demonstrated that sufficient determination and innovative tactics could overcome any static defensive system, regardless of how sophisticated or comprehensive. The technical analysis conducted by German naval engineers revealed the ingenious simplicity of the British tactical approach. Rather than attempting to match complex German defensive systems with equally complex offensive weapons and elaborate attack plans, the X-craft represented radical minimalism in design philosophy. They were far too small for conventional detection methods designed to locate full-sized submarines. They were too mechanically quiet for hydrophone systems designed to detect the engine noise signatures of standard submarines. They were too simple mechanically to suffer the kinds of equipment failures that German planners had confidently assumed would stop any such long-range special operation before it could succeed. Every aspect of their design had been optimized for this single specific mission, deliberately accepting severe limitations in other areas that would be completely unthinkable in a conventional submarine design. The British had designed a weapon specifically to defeat the Tirpitz's defences, and it had worked exactly as intended. The British reaction to Operation Source combined jubilation at the successful crippling of the Tirpitz with profound grief for the men who had been lost. 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the operation, including to Place and Cameron, who had survived as prisoners, and posthumously to Henty Creer of X-5. The strategic impact was immediately apparent to British naval planners. The vast naval resources that had been tied down in northern waters solely to contain the Tirpitz threat could now be redeployed to support other critical operations, including the planned invasion of Europe in 1944. The German response to Operation Source extended far beyond immediate damage control efforts to fundamental revision of naval doctrine. The attack had conclusively demonstrated that technological superiority and defensive complexity could be decisively defeated by human determination combined with innovative tactical thinking. Nazi racial ideology, which had consistently portrayed the British as decadent and lacking in willpower, could not adequately explain how men would knowingly sail tiny submarines on what appeared to be suicide missions, with full understanding of the odds against survival. The Kriegsmarine's official war diary noted with evident surprise that the British attackers had displayed determination and courage exceeding what was normally considered the limits of military duty. Various attempts to repair the Tirpitz and return her to operational status revealed the absolute completeness of her destruction as an offensive naval weapon. German engineers worked throughout the winter of 1943 to 44 in the freezing Norwegian climate, but the damage to her machinery proved irreversible without access to complete dry dock facilities that simply did not exist in Norway. The twisted hull plates created progressive flooding that required constant pumping operations just to keep the ship afloat at her moorings. The massive main turbines, violently knocked from their mounting foundations by the tremendous shock waves from the explosions, could not be properly realigned or remounted in the limited facilities available in the fjord. By March of 1944, it had become painfully clear to all involved that the Tirpitz would never again operate as a true warship capable of offensive operations. She had effectively become nothing more than a floating battery, capable only of defending her immediate anchorage area and incapable of putting to sea. As a direct result of the damage inflicted during Operation Source, the Tirpitz never went to sea again for the remainder of the war. The strategic impact on overall German naval strategy was absolutely profound and far-reaching. Without the Tirpitz functioning as an active threat to Allied shipping, the British Royal Navy could redeploy the battleships, aircraft carriers, and cruisers that had been permanently stationed at Scapa Flow specifically to contain her. These powerful warships were desperately needed to support the massive invasion of Europe being planned for the summer of 1944. The strategic arithmetic was striking in its clarity. 6 experimental midget submarines, operated by small crews of volunteers, had succeeded in freeing up enough Allied naval power to significantly support Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings. Admiral Tovey, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, calculated that Operation Source had effectively released naval forces equivalent to a full battle squadron for redeployment to other critical duties. The ability of the German surface fleet to pose any credible threat to Allied merchant shipping had been effectively ended by small teams of men in midget submarines. The technological lessons learned from Operation Source influenced submarine development programs worldwide in the post-war period. The Soviet Union, carefully studying the details of the attack, began developing their own special-purpose submarines designed for similar missions. The United States Navy, which had previously been highly skeptical of such specialized vessels with limited capabilities, initiated development programs that would eventually produce swimmer delivery vehicles and other special operations craft. The revolutionary concept that a submarine could be designed for a single specific mission type, deliberately accepting severe limitations in other areas in exchange for optimized capabilities in one area, gradually became accepted naval doctrine across multiple nations. German Admiral Friedrich Ruger, writing extensively about naval operations after the war ended, identified Operation Source as the precise moment when the Kriegsmarine lost fundamental faith in the concept of conventional naval superiority achieved through technology and defensive planning. If the most heavily defended anchorage in all of German-controlled territory could be successfully penetrated by submarines approximately the size of fishing boats, then the entire foundational concept of protecting naval bases through static defences required complete revision. However, such revision would have required resources that Germany simply no longer possessed by late 1943. The thousands of man-hours spent attempting to repair the Tirpitz, the scarce materials consumed in the effort, the highly specialized technical workers diverted from other critical projects, all represented resources that Germany could not afford to spare during the period of 1943 to 44. Dönitz himself admitted in post-war writings that the resources expended on attempting to repair Tirpitz after Operation Source could have instead built approximately 50 U-boats, which would have been far more valuable to Germany's naval war effort. The prisoners captured from X6 and X7 spent the remainder of the war in German captivity, but were generally treated with unusual respect by their captors. German naval officers, recognizing fellow seamen who had achieved something genuinely extraordinary against overwhelming odds, ensured the prisoners received proper treatment in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Cameron and Place were frequently interviewed by German naval intelligence officers, not primarily for military information, but rather from sheer professional curiosity about how they had managed to achieve what German doctrine had declared impossible. One German officer reportedly told Place during an interview that German planners had calculated defences against every possible form of attack they could imagine, but had never calculated that men would willingly accept certain death merely to damage a single ship. Place corrected him with characteristic understatement, explaining that they had not accepted certain death, but rather had accepted probable death, and that there was a significant difference between the two concepts. The final comprehensive accounting of Operation Source revealed its extraordinary efficiency in purely military economic terms. 9 X-craft had been constructed specifically for the operation at a cost of approximately £50,000 each. 6 had actually participated in the mission itself. 3 had successfully attacked the target and placed their charges. The damage inflicted on the Tirpitz was conservatively estimated at £3 million in repairs that were never actually completed. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, the battleship's 6 months of complete inactivity, followed by permanent crippling freed Allied naval resources, conservatively worth hundreds of millions of pounds. In the cold mathematical calculations of warfare economics, Operation Source achieved a return on investment that arguably no other conventional naval operation of the entire war could match. Norwegian resistance members who had risked their lives to provide critical intelligence for the operation faced severe German reprisals once their involvement was discovered. Several were executed by firing squad, while others were sent to concentration camps where many perished. Yet despite these terrible consequences, the Norwegian underground resistance continued providing valuable intelligence on the Tirpitz's condition throughout the following year, enabling the Allies to verify that she remained crippled and posed no threat to operations. This ongoing intelligence was absolutely crucial, as it prevented the Allies from wasting scarce resources on attacking a ship that had already been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. The British forces continued launching attacks against the Tirpitz throughout 1944, apparently unaware of just how completely Operation Source had already crippled the battleship. These follow-up attacks, including operations designated Tungsten, Mascot and Goodwood, inflicted additional damage to the already crippled ship, but were essentially attacking a vessel that had already been defeated as an operational warship. Finally, on the 12th of November 1944, Lancaster bombers from the Royal Air Force, equipped with massive 12,000-pound bombs, tallboy bombs, scored 2 direct hits and a near miss, which caused the ship to capsize rapidly at her moorings near Tromsø. Between 950 and 1,204 men died in this final attack, trapped inside the capsizing hull. However, the Tirpitz had effectively been mission-killed 13 months earlier by the X-craft attack, and had posed no operational threat since that time. The psychological impact of Operation Source on the German Navy extended far beyond the immediate physical damage inflicted on the Tirpitz. The 22nd of September 1943 marked the precise day when the Kriegsmarine's fundamental faith in defensive superiority through technology was irrevocably shattered. If their most comprehensively protected naval asset could be successfully reached and crippled by craft so impossibly small they should not even exist according to established German naval doctrine, then every foundational assumption about modern naval warfare required complete revision. Young German naval officers, trained throughout their careers to believe absolutely in the superiority of German engineering and meticulous planning, watched in shock as their most sophisticated defensive systems were penetrated by submarines using diesel engines literally converted from London buses. The propulsion system for each X-craft consisted of a 4-cylinder Gardner 4LK diesel engine that had been converted from a type commonly used in London buses. The profound irony of this fact was certainly not lost on the German technical officers who examined the intelligence reports. In an attempt to demonstrate that the Tirpitz remained a potent offensive weapon despite the growing threat, Admiral Karl Dönitz had ordered an attack on Allied installations at Spitzbergen. This attack, conducted from September 6th to 8th of 1943, just 2 weeks before Operation Source occurred, represented the only time in her entire operational career that Tirpitz fired her massive main guns in an actual offensive operation against enemy targets. During the bombardment of shore installations, the Tirpitz fired 52 rounds from her main battery and 82 rounds from her 15-centimetre secondary guns. This bombardment was the first and only time in the ship's career that she fired her main battery at an enemy surface target. The apparent success of this raid had significantly reinforced German confidence in the Tirpitz's continued value and supposed invulnerability in her Norwegian anchorage. Within just 2 weeks of this confidence-building exercise, that certainty would be destroyed forever by tiny submarines most German officers had never imagined could exist. The extraordinarily thorough training program that enabled Operation Source's ultimate success had been remarkable in its comprehensiveness and duration. Operation Source possessed an advantage not normally associated with high-risk special operations. The crews had enjoyed almost 18 full months to train specifically for this mission. Every conceivable aspect of the operation had been rehearsed hundreds of times under increasingly realistic conditions. The crews had practiced net-cutting techniques, ship attack profiles, emergency procedures, and escape techniques until they could perform them in complete darkness by touch alone. This exceptional level of preparation proved absolutely crucial when equipment failed and carefully laid plans collapsed under the pressure of reality. When Cameron's periscope flooded and became useless, he could still navigate effectively by dead reckoning because he had thoroughly memorized every bearing and distance during training. When place became hopelessly entangled in defensive nets 3 separate times, he knew instinctively which specific combination of ballast operations offered the best chance of breaking free, because he had practiced similar emergency situations repeatedly during training exercises. Comprehensive post-war analysis conducted by the United States Navy concluded that Operation Source represented nothing less than a fundamental paradigm shift in modern naval warfare theory. Admiral William Halsey, carefully studying the operation's planning and execution, noted that it conclusively demonstrated the inherent vulnerability of any static defensive system to sufficiently determined special operations attacks conducted with appropriate weapons. The comforting concept of absolute security achieved through defensive complexity and technological superiority had been proven completely false. If sufficient accurate intelligence could be gathered about a target and appropriate special weapons could be developed and deployed, then virtually any target could theoretically be reached and attacked regardless of defensive arrangements. This profound lesson would significantly influence American military planning throughout the entire Cold War period and beyond, leading directly to the development of Navy SEAL teams and other specialized special operations forces designed to accomplish missions conventional forces could not. The German naval staff's own post-war analysis of Operation Source was even more sobering in its conclusions for the future of naval warfare. Vice Admiral Helmuth High wrote extensively that Operation Source marked the definitive end of the battleship era more conclusively than any traditional fleet action or surface engagement possibly could have. If small crews in midget submarines could successfully cripple the most powerful and heavily protected battleship in European waters, then the entire age of the capital ship as the dominant weapon of naval warfare was truly finished. The enormous resources that Germany had invested in constructing and maintaining the Tirpitz, resources sufficient to build hundreds of U-boats or thousands of combat aircraft, had been effectively neutralized by a British investment smaller than the cost of constructing a single destroyer. The strategic inefficiency was staggering. The ripple effects of Operation Source extended throughout the remaining course of the war in multiple ways. German naval bases from occupied France to Norway implemented extensive new defensive measures, necessarily diverting scarce resources from offensive operations to static defense. Thousands of combat troops were reassigned to harbor defense duties that produced no offensive capability. Expensive new detection equipment was developed and hastily deployed at enormous cost throughout naval facilities. Yet every German naval commander understood with uncomfortable clarity the fundamental truth that no defensive system could be made absolutely impenetrable. If the British were genuinely willing to accept such unfavourable odds for a single attack operation, they would certainly attempt similar attacks again in the future. The operational paranoia this realization created throughout the Kriegsmarine was almost as strategically valuable as the actual physical damage inflicted on the Tirpitz. For the Royal Navy, Operation Source provided definitive validation of years of unconventional thinking about special operations. The X-Craft development program had faced considerable skepticism from traditionalist naval officers who viewed midget submarines as interesting toys completely unworthy of serious consideration for actual combat operations. The spectacular success achieved against the Tirpitz permanently silenced these critics and skeptics. Significant resources began flowing into expanded special operations development programs. New and improved X-Craft were constructed incorporating lessons learned from Operation Source. By the war's end, the Royal Navy had successfully developed an entire comprehensive spectrum of unconventional vessels, ranging from human torpedoes to swimmer delivery vehicles to demolition craft, all tracing their conceptual lineage directly back to the X-Craft that had crippled the Tirpitz in her Norwegian anchorage. The human cost of Operation Source, while relatively modest in absolute numbers compared to major fleet actions, remained profoundly significant for those who survived and for the families of those who did not. The survivors carried deep physical and psychological scars for the remainder of their lives. Cameron and Place, despite both receiving Victoria Crosses for extraordinary valour, rarely spoke publicly about their harrowing experiences during the attack. The crushing weight of having sent fellow crewmen to almost certain death, even in the legitimate context of wartime operations, was a psychological burden that never fully lifted from their shoulders. Aitken, who had miraculously escaped from the sunken X-7 lying on the bottom of the fjord, suffered from severe claustrophobia for decades afterward, unable to tolerate enclosed spaces. The German defenders of Calfjord also paid a significant price that extended beyond the physical damage to their ship and their professional pride. Many suffered from what would now be immediately recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The crew members of the Tirpitz, once intensely proud to serve aboard the Kriegsmarine's most powerful and prestigious vessel, spent the remainder of the war trapped on a crippled ship that could no longer fulfill its primary design mission. Morale throughout the crew plummeted steadily and never recovered to previous levels. When the Tirpitz was finally sunk by aerial bombing in November of 1944, many survivors reportedly felt overwhelming relief that their prolonged ordeal was finally over, rather than grief at losing their ship. In the broader strategic context of World War II, Operation Source conclusively demonstrated that technological superiority alone could never guarantee military victory. The Germans had created what they sincerely believed was the perfect defensive system according to every principle of naval warfare they understood and had studied. They had meticulously prepared for every conceivable contingency they could possibly imagine. Yet they had fundamentally failed to account for human determination pushed far beyond what rational analysis would consider acceptable limits. The X-Craft crews had willingly accepted odds of survival that German operational planning deemed completely impossible for any rational military force to accept, because the crews were absolutely desperate to eliminate the strategic threat that Tirpitz posed to Allied operations, and sometimes desperation can transform the theoretically impossible into the merely highly unlikely. The profound influence of Operation Source extended well beyond the conclusion of World War II into the Cold War era and beyond. During the Cold War confrontation, both NATO and Warsaw Pact military forces extensively studied the attack as an ideal model for special operations, planning and execution. The Israeli Navy's successful attacks on Egyptian naval vessels specifically used tactical principles directly developed from detailed study of Operation Source, The Argentine Navy's operational planning for potential operations against British naval forces during the Falklands conflict in 1982 specifically referenced the X-craft attacks as clear examples of how smaller forces employing unconventional methods could successfully threaten much larger conventional forces. Even in the 21st century, naval special operations forces worldwide continue to study Operation Source as a masterclass in mission planning, realistic training, and disciplined execution under extreme odds. The various technical innovations specifically developed for Operation Source also had lasting impact on submarine development. The wet and dry compartments that allowed divers to exit from submerged submarines became standard equipment on special operations submarines worldwide. The ultra-thin periscopes originally developed for the X-craft to minimize visual detection influenced submarine periscope design for many decades. The side charge concept for underwater demolition, while not ultimately successful in actually sinking the Tirpitz outright, led directly to development of far more effective limpet mines and sophisticated underwater demolition charges used extensively in subsequent operations. Perhaps the single most profound and lasting legacy of Operation Source was its conclusive demonstration that absolutely no defensive system can ever be considered truly impenetrable. The Germans had created what they genuinely believed was an impregnable fortress protecting their most valuable naval asset. They had implemented multiple layers of redundant defenses, maintained constant patrols, and deployed the most sophisticated detection equipment available. Yet 6 small submarines, crewed by extraordinarily determined men who were fully willing to accept probable death to accomplish their mission, had successfully penetrated every single defensive barrier. This fundamental lesson resonated throughout military planning and doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century and continues to influence military thinking today. The final words perhaps belong most appropriately to Lieutenant Godfrey Place, who survived the war despite his harrowing experiences and lived long enough to see his actions studied and analysed in naval academies worldwide. When asked many years later whether he had truly understood the unfavourable odds against successfully completing the mission and surviving, he replied with characteristic British understatement, "Of course we knew the odds. That's precisely why we knew it would actually work. The Germans performed their calculations perfectly and their mathematics was flawless. But they calculated that no rational military force would ever accept those odds against success. We weren't attempting to be rational, we were simply trying to win the war. Sometimes those are fundamentally different things entirely." The German officers who had so confidently dismissed the theoretical possibility of midget submarines posing any credible threat to capital ships learned the hardest and most painful lesson of modern warfare through bitter experience. Sheer determination can overcome careful calculation. Bold innovation can decisively defeat meticulous preparation. Small crews who willingly accept probable death can fundamentally change strategic reality far more effectively than thousands of men who simply follow conventional doctrine and established procedures. The X-craft attack on the Tirpitz proved conclusively that in warfare, much like in physics, the smallest particles, when properly directed, can release the most devastating energy. The German Navy never fully recovered from the profound psychological impact of Operation Source, that singular moment when their most powerful weapon was permanently crippled by their smallest enemy. The fundamental mathematics of naval warfare had been completely rewritten in the cold, dark waters of a remote Norwegian fjord, and the strategic equation would never be quite the same again,